Welcome to the SBR Authors Podcast. This is part one where we explore the theory of complexity. Now you'll enjoy part one of our two-part interview with Dr. Gene Boulton. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and you're in for a double treat today. Why? Because I'm in for a double treat today. The first treat is I'm co-hosting with my good friend and colleague, Earnie Broughton, Earnie from Bernie, as my wife affectionately calls him. But our guest today is Dr. Gene Boulton. Dr. Boulton, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
We are going to talk about her latest book, The Dao of Complexity, Making Sense and Making Waves in Turbulent Times, and really take a deep dive with her into complexity, because both Earnie and I found this incredibly relevant for ethics and compliance professionals. So in thinking through this, in 2005, the largest number of FCPA violations was around third parties. And last year, the largest number of FCPA violations involved third parties. What does that tell you? We have the same issues and the same problems over and over again. So how do we deal with this? How do we come up with policies and procedures? Not that just someone like me as a lawyer can write, and I can write some great policies and procedures, but in terms of impact and effectiveness and engagement with our employees. How can we make organizations run not simply more business efficiently, but more efficiently, effectively with ethics and compliance? How can we influence ethics and values and compliance in our organizations? Both Earnie and I, after reading Dr. Boulton's book, I think had the same question. Perhaps there's a different way. And that's really what we're going to explore today. And all I can tell you is, ladies and gentlemen, you're in for a treat. So her book, also she's the lead author of Embracing Complexity, published by the Oxford Press. She began her career in applied physics before going on to hold executive positions in large corporations. She currently teaches postgraduate programs worldwide. With that incredibly long-winded introduction, Dr. Boulton, on behalf of Earnie and myself, thank you and welcome to the podcast.
No, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it very much.
Could I ask maybe for you to share with us your professional background, maybe even your academic background leading to your professional background, but how all of that led to studying complexity?
Yes, an interesting question that I always have to reflect on. So I guess that there was going right back to being a teenager, I was always one of those annoying teenagers that asked why all the time and read philosophy textbooks for fun. And I had this kind of inquiring mind about why we're here, why is the world, what is the world, all these kind of questions. And I went on to study physics, and which can sound like a very kind of rational, machine-like subject, analytical reason, which of course in many ways it is. But my PhD was in quantum physics. And I often say it addled my brain early, because you're faced with philosophical questions with quantum physics about, is there a reality? What do we mean by reality? How does the world really work? How do I make sense of these paradoxes embedded in quantum physics? So that was a sort of starting point. And I worked in a fairly traditional way. I worked in research physics and then in design engineering. And I did an MBA. I was beginning to feel I was getting more interested in people and organizations. So I did an MBA and transferred into kind of business and management. But I came across the ideas of complexity theory in the late 1980s, initially through hearing Peter Senge speak at a management conference. And he basically had one picture. I remember it really vividly. And he had a picture of a machine and a picture of a leaf. And he said, what is an organization more like, this machine or this organic changing leaf? And that was it, really. That was a kind of aha moment for me that set me off on a path. And as I continued to do management work and management consultancy and eventually executive management positions, you're faced with all the time, things don't go to plan, things happen from left field, that things are interconnected. So when I finally came across complexity theory per se in the early 1990s, it just made sense to me in terms of an understanding of the way the world worked. And because of my physics background, I was able to kind of marry these two streams of social science and management with these ideas coming from science. And I came across Peter Allen, who used to work with Ilya Prigogine, who was working in Cranfield, where I did my MBA. And so it was like the perfect match for me. I was able to join his team and be one of the people who was kind of integrating these kind of strands of ideas into management. So that's a long story of how I got to where I got to.
Earnie, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gene. You have a fascinating background, a polymath in many ways, and radically curious about everything. And I've been really interested in complexity for a couple of years now. And what I found was that once you see the world and yourself through the lens of complexity, nothing is quite ever the same again. And however, a lot of our listeners may not be familiar with complexity. Can you give us a little bit of a level set in preparation for our extended conversation here about exactly what complexity is?
Yeah. So there's the English usage of the word. If I said to my mum, "Do you think the world is complex?" she would have an understanding of what we were talking about, and she would mean, or she would imagine I meant, things are interwoven, uncertain, things affect each other in ways that we can't predict, messy, intertwined, those kind of words. And that certainly is the case. But the science of complexity, the work that in one of the main traditions of this work that I've followed is the work of Ilya Prigogine, looks at the science of complexity, the science of situations that are relational, diverse, have many interacting elements, like we would find in a family, a society, an organization, also an ecology. And the science of complexity, the science of open systems, which was the work that Ilya Prigogine got a Nobel Prize for in 1977, gives you a handle on the nature of that complexity. It doesn't just say things are complex, get over it. It's describing the way the future depends on the history and context, that the world shows up as patterns of relationships. It's looking at those kind of things. And by patterns of relationships, I mean, for example, supposing you were going to work in one organization, you might start to feel, gosh, there's ways of doing things around here. There is a kind of cultural norm that has come about over time for various reasons. The sister organization over there seems to have a completely different culture, completely different way of doing things. And you can sense into those patterns of behavior, those patterns of doing things. You don't have to know everything to start to understand those patterns. And that tells you a lot about how to actually operate in those organizations. So we're interested in complexity, in how patterns emerge, stabilize, and then unravel. And that's the kind of core science of it. So, yeah, that's it.
And it happens in kind of a ceaseless flow. And the terms I've heard is from you, relational, processual, flow. And the title of your book really first grabbed me, the Dao of Complexity. That in a way, complexity is not a new view. And the thing that intrigued you is that it was probably initially described, at least as far as we know, in the Tao Te Ching, which is 2,500 years old. Tell us a little bit more about that connection with the Tao.
Yeah, no, great question. And one paradox about, just to say, about this idea of flow is this idea that sometimes things are always becoming, a word that Prigogine used, but the fact that there's movement is often the reason why things stabilize. So resilience comes from a degree of slack. I think this relates to the issue of ethics that Tom was talking about. How do you get compliance? There's something about stability comes from a sense of always moving, but we move in a relational way. We can adapt and respond. And so the paradox is that things that are always flowing often stay. It is that which creates their resilience. So that there's a sort of link there. Going back to the Tao question, Peter Allen came back to Cranfield one day in, I think it was 2003, saying, clutching the Tao Te Ching, which he'd found on a secondhand bookstall in the underground in London, saying, look at this, it reads just like a complexity theory textbook. And I knew about the Tao Te Ching from my teenage years of reading everything. And so I picked up this particular copy, which had a very long introduction. And it really was absolutely fascinating. And I have gone back to it time and time again. And the way that they were looking at the world in those days, different in a way to how philosophy developed post-Plato, was that they were looking experientially. So they were asking the question of what's the world like through being in it, not through theorizing about it or having ideas of ideal forms over here or whatever. And what they were discovering in this kind of immersion in the world is this idea that things are always becoming, but often they become stabilized. The paradox that the end is in the beginning, that things are path dependent. What you put into the system, the core phrase that I think encapsulates Taoism is the path is made through walking. In other words, that the future is co-created by all the actions and intentions and things that happen on the way. But what is weird is in every way, there are bits of the Tao Te Ching, they talk about the door is not always open, meaning that there are sometimes tipping points. Sometimes things can feel very stuck. And then all of a sudden, there's a kind of whoosh of newness and novelty and a change into something new. So it's incredibly subtle, the way that there's a kind of resonance between the worldview, the ontologies of Taoism and complexity, particularly complexity following the kind of micro-granular, detailed view that comes out of the traditions of people like Prigogine. And what the Tao Te Ching also includes, because in a sense, complexity theory is a science, can explain about how the past shapes the future, but it's not making an ethical statement. It's saying this is how to win and be bad, as well as this is how to create a resilient, fair society. But of course, the Tao isn't. The Tao is saying it's asking how do we cultivate ourselves with the future in mind, with nature in mind, with each other in mind. So it has that kind of, it has a lot of wisdom about how to behave if you want a sustainable, fair, resilient future. What one has to add to complexity is if you want a sustainable, resilient future, then that does determine the sort of path you take. But the Tao goes further than that into that kind of ethical stance.
Let me raise a couple of points. Number one, the past shapes the future in the context of the following. One of the greatest American authors of the 20th century was a gentleman named William Faulkner, a fellow Southerner, whose favorite phrase of mine was, the past is not dead, it's not even past yet. Would that fall into, is that a shorthand for complexity?
It's certainly, what a lovely phrase. Yes, I remember that now. Yes, and what it's saying is not that the future follows inexorably from the past, but that the past shapes but does not determine the future. And certainly the past is not dead. One of the exercises that I do with people sometimes is to say, look at the present, where's it come from, and how deeply embedded is it? Is this a new sort of emerging present, or is there something that's been going on for centuries? Certain sorts of attitudes or ethnic conflicts have been going on a long time. They sometimes go underground a bit, but they haven't been resolved. So that issue of the past shapes the future, but yet there's still room to maneuver. It isn't a sort of deterministic unfolding of the past.
And next, I'd like to ask you to maybe differentiate complexity from a couple of other concepts. The first is chaos, and the second that struck me is game theory. Could you maybe tell us how complexity differs from those concepts?
Chaos theory is a piece of mathematics that was very exciting back in the late 1980s, when we had just about enough computing power to plot using this what's actually a simple recursive equation. And I remember the IT geeks at the place I worked, you'd go past their desk and there'd be this plotting of these kind of fractal shapes like this, and it would be but was terribly exciting. So deterministic chaos is a simple sort of equation that was really radical when we were able to solve it computationally. It showed that simple things can have big effects, that the starting point was very important. It talked about fractals, which is basically saying in these equations that what happens at every scale is mirrored at every other scale. So it was very exciting and was the start of some of this kind of journey. But it is a limited piece of mathematics that doesn't include what Prigogine was interested in, which is how messiness and variation can create patterns which can then emerge. So nothing can emerge in deterministic chaos, and the initial conditions determine everything that goes past. So it's an interesting way to kind of break people's idea that the world is just purely simply a linear machine. But it's a limited view. And in my view, when it gets applied to the social world, it's a bit dangerous. And one of the chapters in Embracing Complexity, the first book, is we looked at all sorts of different simplifying assumptions and showed that they come up with different conclusions. So they're useful, but when you're trying to put them all together and say something about the nature of the social world, it becomes a little bit more limited. Whereas complexity theory, in the tradition that I follow, has more, in a sense, it allows, in a bit like it's an evolutionary kind of approach where variation will lead to new patterns that can't be predicted. So it has a different quality about it. So I hope that helps to answer that question. Game theory, there are many models and forms that demonstrate a level of uncertainty and gaming in that sense, in terms of how do you help shape what you might like to happen, how do people behave. What I'm talking about is more what you would call a worldview or an ontology. So it's not a method, it's an understanding of the way the world is. If the world is complex, we might sometimes find a game theory approach is useful, or we might find a systems mapping approach is useful. But I'm not talking about methodology. I'm talking about an understanding of the nature of the reality, the nature of change. So I hope that helps a little bit.
It does. Earnie, back over to you.
Yeah, I think that it's relatively easy to get a cognitive understanding of complexity. But I think it's helpful for us to feel into how do I actually sense complexity, and to make it not just a cognitive concept, but something that's a felt experience. And one of the thoughts that I've had, and actually, as you were talking, Jean, you and Tom, for example, we spend a lot of our time and resources and treasure making big plans. But when we look back over our lives, some of the most significant things that have happened to us have been what I call the little stumbling blocks in the quantum field.
Yeah.
The chance meetings, the left turn when you should have gone right.
Yeah.
And so that is one window for me into complexity and uncertainty, and the difficulty that we have in really predicting sometimes the outcomes of our actions. Could you give us some of your thoughts about how we sense into and feel into complexity?
Yeah. I've got 2 or 3 examples to give. The first one that you've just used, I sometimes with groups, I use one of 2 different approaches. One of them is to say, think back to when you were 16. Joke. That will be harder for some of you than others. Has your life gone to plan? Think back to when you were 16. What did you think your life would be like? Has your life gone to plan? People, and then we talk about it. Did it go to plan? If not, why not? So then people varyingly say, I had no plan, I went with the flow, or I thought I'd do this, but this happened to me on the way. I remember doing this in East Africa, and somebody saying, my parents died of AIDS when I was 11 and I had 5 siblings and I had to leave school because I had to look after them. In a whole variety of ways, it really brings it home to people that your life doesn't go to plan. And sometimes people will tell stories of literally, I met somebody on a train, or I like the geography teacher, so I decided to do geography, or I went to the university my best friend went to. And you can start to map the emerging truth of our lives, or there was a war, or whatever it is. You can start to understand how both the local and the broader patterns that we live in shape the future for us. I sometimes don't do that one. I do a similar thing where I say to people, you've been involved in business strategy. Who's been involved in a business strategy? People put their hands up. Has your strategy gone to plan? Most people put their hands down. So then we talk about why hasn't it gone to plan? And again, they create this view of the complex world. That department let us down. The market changed. There was a new competition we weren't expecting to happen. We misunderstood. We misread the market. A new market emerged that we weren't expecting. So again, it's another way to get people into it. And I often follow that question up with, so I then teach them about complexity. And then I say, with the complexity in mind, what would you do differently? You still got to have a plan, but how would you do it? How would you work differently with complexity in mind? So we're just getting to things like we'd review it more often. We'd have more contingency. We would have a portfolio of approaches because you never know what will work and what won't work. So in a variety of ways, you get them to kind of reframe for themselves. So that's a couple of approaches I take. And another very different, and it's back to this isn't just cognitive, it's a felt sense. I get people to think about, you've joined a board meeting and you've got to make a contribution to this board meeting. What will turn the decisions in that board meeting? What do you have to do? I sometimes tell this as a story, or I get people to kind of explore this, that if you're going to be adept in this board meeting, you're going to have to sense into the flow. You're going to have to get with the flow of this meeting. Where's the power? Who's allied with whom? Where have they got to so far? And if you're adept at sensing in to this complex situation, you will be more adept at knowing when to intervene, or if to intervene, and what to say, and how can you nudge it to get the particular thing that you're hoping to happen, or to play back to them what you're hearing. So people kind of get that. It's a subjective sensing into the patterning in the room and working with that pattern to kind of nudge it in the sort of direction that you think might be useful. So that's another sort of felt sense. And then another one, just to come up with the final one, is I talk about families, and I say a family is it's like an organization, it's just smaller. I'm a social worker or I'm a teacher. I'm coming to your family because things haven't been going well. And I'm going to assess you, and then I'm going to tell you what kind of a family you are, and I'm going to give you a plan. And if you follow the plan, then it'll work and you'll become a better family. And of course, everybody goes, oh, no, impossible. My family's unique and we're all unique and we've got to where we are for various complex reasons. And that's the point, in a way. We understand when we talk about the societies we live in, the town, the family, we understand its uniqueness, its path dependence, its potential for change. And the point is that an organisation is just a bigger version than that. And there's this middle ground. It doesn't mean we don't plan, just like in a family. If you're trying to change things, you will have a plan, but you'll review it, you will try things out and see what happens. You won't know if you're trying to get to deal with a child who's having difficulties. You'll constantly be trying things out. And sometimes it'll work, surprisingly, sometimes it won't. It's really just getting people to recognize an organization is just a bigger one of those. And we have to handle that complexity in the same way.
And so what you're saying there is, in terms of strategy, it's important to think long-term about the future, but to hold it loosely, but do detailed planning in the short term.
Yes. So have intentions, weave intentions, because there's nothing worse, or it has a different effect on a group of people. If you've woven intentions or woven purpose, and people have a common view of where they're heading, they're more able to take opportunities and adapt because there's a common kind of view of where you're going. If you impose something, this is the plan, this is the intention, it won't hold people in the same way. So weave intention, but then be prepared to expect things not to go to plan, expect things sometimes to go better than plan. we've all seen things in organizations that were actually going better than we could have imagined, and they get killed off because it wasn't in the plan. So it's really saying it's a both and. The complex world is not saying it's all chaotic, we know nothing, nor is it saying it's all predictable. We're in the middle. We're trying to say, how can we get the best of shaping this future so we all know what we're doing, but yet being able to notice if things are either need shifting a bit.
Yeah, I remember a general that I used to work with whose favorite comment was, don't fall in love with the plan.
Yes.
And that's exactly what you're saying. And so what we see is in organizations, occasionally we have the complexity kind of breaks through in terms of people's behavior, that there's a wisdom there that is kind of underlying. And yet, for the most part, people fall into a machine kind of view of the organization. They do things like command and control. They value ends over the means of how to get there. They manage the organization as though there were linear change most of the time, but they don't really plan for or envision the tipping points where change just takes off. And so the mental model that people have is more machine-like. And so from a leadership standpoint, what does a complexity leadership model look like?
I think I just want to say something slightly differently about what you've just said. I think there is a conventional wisdom still in many organizations that the right thing to do is to have a clear plan, clear leadership strategies, tell people what to do and measure whether they did it. But there's a whole other thing that goes on, because most people in organizations know that doesn't work. You can't get anything done if you do that. So there's a sort of pretend game that goes on where you have to kind of fill in the forms and go along with certain things. But in many places, you find informal ways of working and adaptive ways of working that kind of go underground. So there's a sense in which if you talk to people lower down the organization, they're going, oh, yes, we have to fill this in. We have to satisfy the boss here. But actually, we're doing this. We're responding to we've got to we're going to get our sales targets, we're going to have to be adaptive to do that. So I think there's already a mismatch between an espoused kind of machine view and the fact that in some senses, people know it isn't like that. But what I also notice is that when we have organizations where you're rewarded for doing what you're told, as opposed to thinking, I'm sorry, there's that noise because I switched my phone off and it's now beeping at me because it wants to be plugged back in. So I apologize for that. Do you want me to take it out of the room because it keeps beeping, or?
No, it's fine.
Okay. Yes.
Adds to the charm.
Yes, okay, good. It's not me beeping.
Go with the flow.
Yeah, yeah.
Well done, Earnie.
So there's something that goes on in organizations that, because we reward people for sticking to what they're told, people don't learn to be more adaptive and handle complexity. So to give you a kind of rather ghastly example of this, my mother was very ill. She'd had a serious operation and she was being moved from one hospital to another hospital. And I was coming up by train to meet her at this new hospital. When I got to the second hospital, I first of all couldn't find her at all. And then I discovered her sitting up in a day room, hysterical, shouting in this wavering voice. She'd been very unwell. Help me. So when I uncovered what had happened, what I was told was she'd arrived early in the ambulance and she hadn't been admitted. And because she hadn't been admitted, then nothing happens. They don't feed her. They don't take her to the toilet. They don't know whether she can sit up in a chair. They just left her until a bed was available, but there was no bed available, so she wasn't admitted. So I'm saying to the nurse, but, can't you see how distressed she is? And I began to feel that the nurse was so used to following the rules. The rule was she's not been admitted. That's it. It's nothing to do with me. If the patient is distressed or worse than distressed, I've done my job. And we create a culture where people are not rewarded by going a bit further, she could have. So by the time I was a little bit cross, she was admitted within 10 minutes. They found a bed and everything happened and we got the doctor involved. But do you see what I mean? If you create a machine, like if you reward people for just doing as they're told and not rewarded for telling you when things are going well or not going well or taking the initiative, then we dumb down organizations and people eventually leave their personality at the door and just go in and say, you're treating me like a cog in a machine, so I'll behave like one.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote that I ran across, that it's difficult for people to see something that's wrong if their paycheck dictates them not seeing it.
Yes, there's something about
And
that.
maybe for us to end with a couple of quotes from your book that particularly resonated with me. And I'd like to say that in doing my work, I've actually shared these quotes, particular quotes, with people, and they've asked for copies of the quotes. And so this not only resonates with me, I think it will resonate with employees in general, but also with ethics and compliance professionals. And you say in your book, if we let things pass, things of which we don't approve, it becomes increasingly hard and even dangerous to oppose them at a later stage. Once an outcome begins to emerge, it becomes progressively more locked in, which to me talks about the importance of finding your voice and raising your voice skillfully in ways that align with your intention and the outcomes that you hope for. And then in terms of how to live in times of uncertainty and disruption, I love this quote: find our moral compass, face what is happening, show up and play our part, nurture our humanity, value life, value others, value the future, and stay true. Any thoughts from you on those two quotes?
No, I think that's a lovely way to end. Thank you for bringing in those quotes. Yes, thank you.
Earnie, with that, I'm going to ask Dr. Boulton if our listeners wanted any more information on your book or Embracing Complexity as you help businesses navigate this, or if they wanted to connect with you, what might be the best place or places for them to go?
I have a website called embracingcomplexity.com, and on that you'll find information about both books. You'll find talks I've given, articles I've written, and you can message me through that and be in contact with me. And I love hearing from people. I really appreciate these kind of conversations. It's how I learn and develop, through these kind of conversations. So I appreciate the opportunity. Well done. And that's a lovely cover of the book, which is a whole other story of how we came up with such a lovely cover. But thank you so much for having me.
It's been a pleasure, and all I can say to any of our listeners, if you have the opportunity to visit with Dr. Boulton, don't walk, run to it. Thanks so much. We look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this part one of our special two-part interview with Dr. Earnie Broughton, hosted by myself and Earnie Broughton. Stay tuned next week for part two of this interview, where we take a deep dive into ethics and compliance and complexity. Also, I'm excited to tell you about the newest podcast on the Compliance Podcast Network, Upping Your Game, how compliance professionals can incorporate AI into their compliance programs today to build for the future tomorrow. It premieres on May 1 with my co-host, Nick Gallo. Check it out on the Compliance Podcast Network.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day, one actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network, available wherever you listen to podcasts.